Without a doubt, playoff football in the NFL can be a very stressful thing.
Oh no. Sorry. No, but don't.
While having your team be eliminated early in the regular season can allow you to sit back and enjoy the great matchups, if your team is fortunate enough to make the cut, the NFL's single elimination format makes every game a must-win at all costs. Otherwise, you'll be stuck thinking of what could have been for at least the next 6 months, or in more severe cases, the rest of your days on Earth. So in a situation like that, with everything on the line, there's only one thing absolutely nobody wants to affect the outcome of a game. Referees. Every January, the most thankless job in pro sports gets even harder. With every mistake placed under such a magnifying glass, they have the capacity to change the sport forever. So today, I'd like to commemorate some of these moments that have tormented the psyche of fans for years, because, that kind of sounds fun. But before we get into the worst of the worst, I would like to talk positively for a moment about the kind sponsor of this video, CuriosityStream. As I'm sure you're aware, we are rapidly approaching the annual football drought, and while I can't carry the content load all by myself here, thankfully I can also recommend a docu-series I've been watching recently over on CuriosityStream called Fourth and Forever Muck City. It details a rivalry between two schools in South Florida in an area that's generated more NFL talent than any other in the nation, and it also features NFL legends like Santonio Holmes and Anquan Boldin. But that's far from all that's available on CuriosityStream, since they host thousands of documentaries and non-fiction titles for whatever subject you might be looking to learn more about. So if that sounds like something you want to give a try, you can head to curiositystream.com/settheedge and use promo code SETTHEEDGE to get your first 30 days completely free, and from there, you're able to subscribe for $2.99 a month or $19.99 for the whole year. Again, that's code SETTHEEDGE at the link below to get your first month completely free. So a huge thank you to CuriosityStream, and without further ado, let's get back to the video. Let's get one thing straight. Mistakes get made by officials all the time in the playoffs, but the fact is, outrage from fans doesn't boil over so long as the call is eventually negated by the actions on the field. As a result, you've probably forgotten some of the most insane calls you've ever seen, just because the referees ended up bailed out by the game's end result. And to me, there's no better example of that than the 2013 NFC Championship game between the Seattle Seahawks and San Francisco 49ers, which is also quite literally the most painful play to watch on this list. With the game including one of the most iconic endings in postseason history and the rant that made Richard Sherman a household name, lost in the chaos was one particular blown call that looked like it would determine the game's outcome up until it didn't. It's 20-17 in the fourth quarter, and it would be an understatement to say that the Zebras have not been kind to the 49ers this afternoon. But despite some game-altering calls to this point, the worst is still yet to come, and fair warning, the next play is graphic. The Seahawks have the ball with 3rd and goal at the 10, where Russell Wilson completes a pass to Jermaine Kearse to go down at the 1. However, before he hits the ground, 49ers linebacker Navarro Bowman strips the ball and has his leg awkwardly trapped beneath Kearse, tearing both his ACL and MCL on the play. Somehow, in spite of this, the absolute animal maintains possession of the ball. But not only did Bowman sacrifice his season to make that incredible play, it wouldn't even count. For some bizarre reason, the NFL rules stated that the recovery of a fumble was not reviewable if it didn't take place in the end zone or on the sidelines, and Seattle had already been awarded possession on the field, erasing that rightful turnover from the box score forever. So why don't you hear about Fumblegate like other botched playoff mistakes? Well, because the referees were bailed out on the very next play, with a fumble from Marshawn Lynch essentially nullifying the mistake, an intervention from the football gods that allowed the NFL to quietly acknowledge they got the play horribly wrong a couple days later, and then enact the Navarro Bowman rule to make sure that same type of play wouldn't end in the train wreck it almost did a couple years down the road. Unfortunately though, not every officiating crew can be that lucky. Odds are, you immediately recognize the play in the thumbnail of this video, and even though that happened relatively recently, I'd be remiss not to at least mention it considering that even Ray Charles could have made the correct call on that play, and he doesn't even know anything about football. The 2018 NFC Championship was a much anticipated matchup between the New Orleans Saints and Los Angeles Rams in the Superdome, a clash of the 1 and 2 seeds with two of the best offenses in pro football. However, the dogfight that left the two teams tied 20-20 with just under 2 minutes to play would cease to exist in everyone's memory as soon as this play occurred, a clear and obvious pass interference on Nickel Roby-Coleman. He plays the receiver here about as well as an actual Ram might, laying out Tommy Lee Lewis before the ball could get anywhere close to him, but when the whistle was blown, somehow there was no flag on the field. As a result, the Saints' drive would stall out and be forced into a field goal, and eventually, the Rams would win that game in overtime. Regardless of your team affiliation after that, unless I guess if you were a Rams fan, everyone knew the Saints had been robbed, and even though they technically had still squandered a chance to win the game, there were no excuses that were going to be able to talk the NFL out of the worst missed call in league history. It sparked a controversy that spanned days of protests and multiple calls for the game to be replayed. In fact, backlash was so great that the league almost immediately instituted a rule change to be able to challenge pass interference calls and no calls the following season. Though, after a shaky start and very clear disdain for the change from officials, it was shelved after just a 1-year span. Ultimately, there would be no justice for New Orleans, but misery does love company, and they are far from the only fan base that's been left mourning after some playoff heartbreak. Ironing out the rulebook to create a consistent standard for officiating is a constant and often very messy process, but there's really no greater example of how finicky and opaque the NFL rules can be than the plays that have near unanimous agreement from everyone watching, but are eventually overturned after a slow and muddling review by refs that are attempting to make a call that is the most technically correct in the rulebook. This is not a problem limited to the playoffs, of course, but for clear examples, you can look to the '99 NFC title game and Burt Emanuel's catch for the Buccaneers, except this somehow wasn't ruled a catch because the ball just grazed the turf, even though Emanuel had complete possession. The rule would later be changed, but not before the Buccaneers lost out on their opportunity for their first ever Super Bowl appearance. Or how about Dez Bryant's catch for the Cowboys in the 2014 NFC Divisional Round, one of the most high-profile controversies to date? Did Dez catch it? Well, yes, as later rule clarifications would specify and the NFL itself would admit. But in that moment, the officiating crew attempted to make a call that was as by the book as possible, and it resulted with a complete robbery in the last playoff game Tony Romo's Cowboys would make it to. But you know, even though the many catch or no catch calls over the years have been infuriating, at least there was some debate involved, which is more than I can say for our next entry, which stands alone as the top example of an NFL rule so bad it ruined the league for the next 2 decades. The 2001 AFC Divisional Round saw a matchup in snowy Foxborough between the underdog Raiders and the up-and-coming Patriots, led by a quarterback who had been thrust into the starting lineup just 2 weeks into the season, though it was starting to look like he might be the real deal. The near-blizzard conditions proved tough for both offenses, with the Raiders leading just 13-10 with under 2 minutes remaining in regulation. Tom Brady was attempting to lead the Patriots on his first ever signature 2-minute drill. But on 1st and 10 after crossing into Oakland territory, future Hall of Famer Charles Woodson rushed unblocked off the right side, dislodging the football as Brady attempted to secure it, and the Raiders recovering to put a dagger in the Patriots' chances. But hold on just a second. Despite everyone and their mother recognizing this as a clear and obvious fumble, an obscure rule instituted just 2 seasons earlier would end up being invoked when the refs made the final call. The now infamous tuck rule stated that when a player attempts a pass, that pass begins when their arm starts moving forward, even if they lose possession as they are tucking the ball into their body. Therefore, despite even Tom Brady himself accepting that he had likely fumbled the game away, the Patriots were given a second chance on a technicality, which naturally they would use to win that game in overtime, and then continue to bring home 6 Super Bowls over the next 18 years. The tuck rule would eventually be voted out of the NFL rulebook in 2013, but not before it helped to birth the Patriots dynasty, a credit that will forever make it one of the most hated rules in all of league history. Up until this point in the video, all of the controversies we've covered have been based on a single play, but to close out this little journey, I'd like to talk about the single worst ref game in playoff history, a game so poorly called the lead official apologized for negatively impacting the game's outcome years later. Super Bowl 40 between the Seahawks and Steelers was a matchup of 2 different but talented squads. In one corner, you had the well-rounded but unglamorous 13-3 Seattle, and in the other, you had the 11-5 Pittsburgh Steelers, who had both a quarterback with a promising career on the horizon and franchise centerpieces that were in the twilight of their NFL careers. It looked to be an interesting dynamic, but the sheer number of calls that seemed to fall against Seattle left many in the crowd feeling like Pittsburgh had a little more help than necessary to complete their storybook finish. Unlike the other entries on this list, it wasn't one devastating call that put the Seahawks down for the count or any one ruling that spoiled their chances, but rather 1,000 paper cuts that helped to shift the tide in the Steelers' favor. You can really take your pick. There's the debatable offensive pass interference that negated a Hawks touchdown and kind of set the tone for the night, the questionable ruling on Ben Roethlisberger's 3rd and goal sneak, or the walking back of a completed pass to the 1-yard line as an uncalled offsides on Pittsburgh led to a holding penalty that was flagged on Seattle, or maybe the truly bizarre low block penalty on Matt Hasselbeck for making the tackle on an interception return. It was a slugfest that made casual viewers around the nation pretty queasy to have witnessed, with a final score of 21-10 that felt at least in part aided by Bill Levy and his crew of officials that night. As an impartial party, I don't think it's entirely fair to say the referees lost the game for the Seahawks, as there were still plenty of opportunities for Seattle to seize control of the game in spite of some questionable flags. Even though, I get it, referees, especially bad ones, will always make an excellent and everlasting scapegoat. However, in the same breath, the fact that people watching felt Seattle was working against 2 opponents at once is concrete evidence at the very least that the officiating failed, and I think that's really the biggest takeaway you can garner from any of these games. Refereeing the highest stakes matchups in pro football is by no means an easy job, but you really only know you've done it well when no one even notices you're there. Because in reality, the greatest moments in NFL history can only take place as a result of sound calls made by the officials, even if there's no one to cheer them on or give them millions of dollars for it. But for as overlooked as referees can be, there's still one thing for sure. If years down the road a game you called is remembered strictly for the refereeing, it's definitely not because you made the correct call.